So Nancy, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'm glad to be part of this this now somewhat legendary course that you're running with all kinds of great participants, both from the New School and beyond. And the essay that I asked everyone to read is actually really, in a sense, comes out of my most recent book, which is the co-authored book with Rahel Yegi called Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory. And in that book, as in a number of recent articles that I've published in the last few years, I've tried to develop what I call an expanded view of capitalism, which rejects the idea that capitalism can be understood as an economic system, and instead tries to map the basic contours, the institutional topography, if you like, of the larger social order in which a capitalist economy is embedded. And in trying to do that, I have tried to create something like a synthesis of the two Karls, Marx and Polanyi. Because Polanyi was most concerned with the relation between the economy and its background conditions in a capitalist society, arguing that the so-called self-regulating market, left to its own devices, would necessarily consume, destabilize, erode its own necessary background conditions, including nature, including political power, including community life, including the human beings who constitute the bearers of that strange commodity called labor power. And on the other hand, there are some, I think, some deficits in that Karl that you can get from the other Karl. Be that as it may, my aim in developing this broader view of capitalism was to try to develop a broader view of what was wrong with capitalism and what therefore a socialist alternative would have to address. So in looking at social reproduction as a necessary background condition for commodity production, that clearly brings into play, in a major way, brings into the foreground of capitalist society relations of kinship, community, family, everything that feminists call social reproduction. So there's a strong gender dimension then, which is not a sort of superstructural, secondary, unimportant feature of a capitalist society, but a fundamental structural constitutive feature. And the same is true, I argued, for questions of racial oppression, which have to do with capitalism's reliance on unfree or semi-free or dependent labor that doesn't go through a wage contract, and which has everything to do with the non-accidental imbrication of capitalist development with colonialism, imperialism, racial oppression, the so-called global color line. So that's the whole distinction, fundamental, I think, and structural, again, necessary in capitalism, between exploitation and expropriation, both of which I think are necessary and imbricated forms of labor inputs. Same thing with public power, where you can't have capitalist accumulation, capital accumulation without public power, and yet there's a strong built-in tendency for capital to weaken and try to work around public power, to hollow it out, to, in various ways, degrade it, turn it into its own servant. I think all of these, let's say, irrationalities and unjust fault lines in capitalist society have been brought to a really tremendous pitch of intensity these contradictions, these tensions, these self-undermining features of capitalism are in the present have reached a pitch of intensity that we haven't seen for a very long time. That has to do with the specifically neoliberal or financialized form of capitalism we have at the present. And naturally, I, like probably everybody else, has been thinking a lot lately in the moment of the COVID pandemic about how all of these things play out. And I think the analysis that I've been developing in this work on the expanded view of capitalism is actually turns out to be quite useful for and on point for understanding why we've been left so vulnerable to this pandemic. So, so finally, like many other people in the last few years, I started to wonder why the term socialism began to suddenly enjoy such a renaissance, such an extraordinary revival in the United States of all places. Like many other people, I started to think, okay, so what really does socialism mean, or what should it mean? It's being used in a very loose way as a kind of buzzword by all kinds of people. And this essay that I asked you to read was a first attempt, and it's extremely preliminary, as you can see, a first attempt to try to start from that expanded view of capitalism and then argue that this entails necessarily an expanded view of socialism, one that would not only aim at reorganizing the economy, but the economy's relation to its background conditions of possibility, the relation of production to reproduction, of public power to private power, or states and markets, if you like, the relation of human society to nature, the ecological problematic, and so on and so forth. This is a first attempt to just sort of lay out what the parameters of such a project would be. I'm under no illusion that I've actually given anything that rises to the level of being an actual conception or even definition, let alone blueprint. I was never my intention to give a blueprint. But anyway, this is, I hope, something that's good to think with. And it turns out that socialism is something a lot more complicated and difficult, I think, than we ever thought. And it makes us really try to look beyond what the monetized, calculable aspects of things to try to understand what are the true reproduction costs of our form of life and what it would mean to actually take responsibility for replenishing the energies and resources that are used up for regenerating what is damaged, for repairing all the sort of what economists would call the externalities that capitalism generates, above and beyond redressing its well-known exploitation of wage labor and so on and so forth. So that's the agenda, and I really love to hear your comments, your thoughts, objections, questions, whatever. And I just open it up.
Let me start. So this is, I think, a very important project of Nancy's, and I hope that she's going to go on with it. In the last few years, starting maybe in the 90s, there have been a series of attempts. I think Robin Blackburn's was about the first. I think that John Roemer and many people, he's in dialogue with Arato and Wright and all the rest, went second, and then Axel Honneth, too, who was presented here by Ross Poole early on in the discussion. So Nancy now has become one of the people. Even I wrote a relatively short piece in Constellations, which people can look at. It was just from 2019. But in any case, Nancy obviously indicates, even in terms of what she said, that she's going to go on with this and do something much larger, more substantial. And in that sense, of course, any criticism at this point would be unfair because she is going to revisit this and think about it. But I just want to basically pursue one particular line. And I very much welcome the Polanyi-Marx synthesis. And I think that is a great idea. You've been working with Polanyi for a long time. And we too have worked with him in a different way in trying to deepen the concept of civil society with his notion of the social and his idea of the defense of the life world, which he has before Habermas. And so this is really very much welcome. And yet, I think the Polanyi-Marx thing adds a certain simplicity to the scheme. I have no problem, of course, with the idea of the concrete totality. In other words, to look at capitalist society not just as an economy, but all the other dimensions that you introduce. And I'm not going to summarize, you just did. Gender and the labor which is associated with that, exploitation basis of race, nature, physical nature, and animal nature too. And then finally, the political, these are the things that you add. And my feeling is that just as in Polanyi, the social is a little bit undifferentiated, so this is undifferentiated too. Not that they all do not matter. I think that you are very right in terms of showing their importance. What we would say functionality, but it's not a popular term anymore, for the reproduction of capitalism. No capitalism could exist without at least some combination of these domains. But in any case, that doesn't mean that their role is entirely parallel. And I would say that even in your scheme, the state or the political has a special role. One doesn't see it when you expand capitalism as much, but when you turn to the solution, namely the expanded notion of socialism, you have to put the political in a different place than the others. A different place, a pride of place, because in fact, you're not suggesting that either just history on its own is going to produce this expanded socialism, nor even that it is the role of a political vanguard or an authoritarian agency to impose it. Your scheme has to do with political democracy too. That is neglected and deformed under capitalism. And that means, of course, you want to bring it back. But bringing it back cannot be brought back on the same level as the other domains. The other domains are present, of course, on the active level to the extent that they give a role to social movements. But even social movements have only indirect ability to change the social, or in this case, capitalism. So the role of the state is central. It is central at two stages. I would put it in my language for a second. It is central in the constituent sense and in the constituted sense. Constituant and constitué. It is central on both levels. Easier to talk about the constitué because there you speak about it. I mean, after all, once you really want to introduce justice in all the spheres that you discussed, somebody has to do that. Moreover, I think you also have a short-term program. You don't use the language I used here, long and short-term, but I think at the very last part of the paper, you turn to something more short-term, which is the economic, your system of a tripartite division of the economy and the role of market in it is what would certainly play a role in making the other changes that you want possible. But the central question here is not the political as such playing that role, but a democratic political. So on the level of the constitué, it has to be a political power which is accountable, responsible, representative to a democratic world. You have a relatively vague presentation of that in terms of combinations of representative, functional, and other forms of democracy. But I think we're on the same track there. You want to democratize the existing democracies in a fairly radical way, and it is that democratized terrain which would make the constituted powers work in a way that you wish to make them work. It's not a vanguardism that you're proposing. You're proposing a democratic system of some kind, a much more democratic system than the present. But there's a problem, a deeper problem on the level of the constituant. Now, I know that you have had this question before because that's what students immediately ask, right? It's a nice scheme. I completely agree with it. How are we going to get there, right? That one can imagine within the socialist tradition only two ways of getting to anything, namely reform or revolution, right? And I would say that for your scheme, both would be paradoxical. That both would have a potential problem of not being able to get, for very special reasons, where you want to get to. Okay, I stop.
Okay. Okay, so there are so many things that you said that are interesting and maybe worth commenting on before I even get to these big questions that you've raised at the end. I think that, I mean, in this paper, I mean, like I say, there's a whole book and about a half a dozen articles that lie behind this little paper. And one thing that you would find if you went back to some of that stuff would be the whole question about boundary struggles as fundamental to capitalist society, as fundamental as what Marxists think of as class struggles. So, I mean, there is a lot of attempt to think about what it means to say that the economy, if you want to use the Polanyi's term, is embedded or at least situated in relation to these other institutions. There is a functionalist strand of the argument, but it is not overall a functionalist argument because it has to do with the idea that there are distinct normativities that pertain to each of these institutional spheres. There's a lot of normative complexity in normative pluralism in a capitalist society. Again, not accidentally. And a huge amount of conflict in this society has to do with exactly where the lines between markets and states are drawn, between family life and commodity production are drawn, between nature and human society are drawn, and about which normativities are correctly mobilized in which spheres. So it's a way of trying to understand why certain kinds of conflict are endemic to capitalist societies and why the critique of it emerges from inside it and not, you know, by some putative, from some putative external Archimedean point. So, and I think this part of it, which is not discussed in this paper, is the strand of it that I think begins to develop or to provide some of the conceptual resources that we need for asking the question about transition, how we get from here to there, assuming we even know what the there is, which I'm not wholly convinced that I do. But in other words, I'm starting from a presupposition, which I think is found in both of the Carls, actually, which is that it's a conflict generative form of social order, and like any good kind of left Hegelian, the possibilities for transformation, hopefully democratic and emancipatory transformation, but no guarantee of that. The possibilities for transformation are given imminently in the logic of the social order, and more importantly, in the various historical forms through which the social order evolves, because I've got a whole sort of history of how struggle over these boundary questions renovates, leads to, in crisis moments, major institutional restructuring of capitalist societies in different phases. So I think that brings us, let me just say something about the present. Today, I think it should be obvious, we don't have to belabor the point, that the kinds of boundary that our form of capitalism has institutionalized between non-human nature and human society has become deeply dysfunctional and is itself a site of enormous social conflict. That boundary is a site of struggle and a stake in struggle at the same time. The same is true over the boundary between social reproduction and commodity production for profit. That's even more than, I think, traditional labor struggles of the sort that Marxists always tried to, treat as very privileged and paradigmatic. Even more than that, I would say struggles over social reproduction today and over this boundary between production and reproduction are iconically the most the cutting edge of a lot of social struggle in our time. And questions over relation between state and market have certainly are huge. And you can see the coronavirus situation, right, along exactly these fronts. There's the ecological dimension of it, all about the disrupted habitats of these animals that end up in the wet markets and so on, zootonic leaps and so on. The vast underinvestment, disinvestment in social reproduction, above all in health systems, but not only, under this neoliberal form of capital. All of these things are just crying out the general weakening of public power, its subservience, the institutionalized subservience of that to global finance, large institutional investors, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, we like to have a textbook case of all of this, and this huge proliferation of languages of contestation, which draw on the normativities associated with these various spheres. So, long story short, part of what my agenda is here is to try, is by drawing a map of all of this. I want to try to suggest that there is, despite all the internal complexity and plurality, there is one social system here. And if the various social movements and struggling collectivities situated at one point or another in relation to this single, albeit internally highly differentiated, complex social system, if they could locate themselves on a map and understand in that way the way their immediate struggles connect up with those of others whom they might have at first sight thought they had little in common with, we begin to get something like, I think this is why the term socialism is attracting so much interest now. It's standing as a placeholder. No one bothers to really with it, except for the few theorists that Andrew rightly mentioned. No one bothers to try to define it, but it's a symptom of a hunger for some way of figuring out how to coordinate and join forces on a scale that is necessary to actually transform the conditions that generate each collective's individual primary concern. So if we want to ask about transition, I don't, of course, there's nothing vanguardist or whatever, but I do assume that that social struggles could, in our time, if they had a large enough and ambitious enough vision, and as well as a deep enough understanding of what are the root causes of all of these irrationalities, dysfunctionalities, injustices, forms of oppression. Yes, that we would be looking at the possibility of a major moment of the constituent power asserting itself. I consider such moments very rare in history. They are true crisis moments. They are interregna in which a previous provisional, semi-stable compromise formation is no longer holding, and everything is spilling out and clamoring for out-of-the-box thinking, for whatever. I think we're in that kind of a moment now, so it is a moment for constituent power. And that, as you rightly say, is a totally different question from that of what the desirable replacement successor social order should look like, and what the role of officially constituted, institutionalized public powers would be in that new institutional order. These are totally two different questions. I don't know that I have a fully worked out or satisfactory answer to either of those questions, but I am, the motivation for the project as a whole is to contribute to say something about both of them. And as I say, I think almost performatively, by constructing this kind of map, which is similar to what we did in the Feminist Manifesto for Feminism for the 99%, was an attempt to make a map, to sort of show people how to think more deeply about the larger social and historical context, the order in which their struggles are embedded, and how they could be transformed in a moment of crisis in which tinkering around the edges, the usual kinds of system conforming reforms are not adequate. So that maybe gets to your reform or revolution idea. If revolution means, seizing the Winter Palace or whatever, then that's not what we're talking about. But if we are talking about a major institutional restructuring, I would distinguish between, periods of normal politics, when people take for granted the existing rules of the game and then try to introduce changes to better, the situation for themselves or their allies and whomever within those terms, from the kind of moment which I think we're in now, in which there's a real crisis of credibility or of hegemony surrounding those terms. And so there's a widespread sense that, something, quote unquote, I would prefer the language of system conforming versus non-system conforming, But fine, I don't mind. I won't shy away from the word revolution as long as we're clear that it's a matter of the depth of the structural transformation and not a matter of the methods used to achieve it, right? We're not talking about violence, non-violent, those kinds of questions of method. So, all right, why don't I stop there? I could, there's plenty more to be said, but let's hear from the students, the other participants.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. My question is about the markets. I really like this this formula that you bring in the article of no markets at the top, no markets at the bottom, and markets in between. And you have this very interesting discussion on the markets in the book with Jael. I was wondering if you see in a socialist, post-capitalist society, if you see the role of markets being something beyond organizing production, if there is something more constitutive to the roles of markets, why do you keep them even in between? So that would be my question. Thank you.
So one thing I do in the book is to distinguish sort of three ways to think about markets. We can talk, I mean, the problem is that term markets, it covers much too much ground, right? I mean, this is a great thing about Polanyi is, you know, his insistence on the huge variety of markets in human history. The idea that they're an exclusively capitalist institution is problematic, and therefore a certain kind of, let's say, simple-minded socialism that it's about getting rid of markets is therefore equally unfortunate. So, but we can distinguish between markets having a distributive role, an allocative role, and a formative force. And those are three different things. The allocative, I think, is really specific to capitalism. And I think this is what Polanyi meant when he talked about fictitious commodification. He meant that the idea was that sort of all the major inputs into capitalist production are themselves commodities. I always love the great title of Piero Schwaffa's book, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. I think that's a perfect description of what the sort of specificity of markets as allocating all the basic resources of society. It's fund of labor, it's raw materials, it's credit and finance. All of these things are not just inputs that society could reflect about what it has at its disposal, how it wants to prioritize the use, and so on and so forth, but their allocation is itself determined in terms of basically profit calculations of people who hold property titles and those things. So that's very different from a simple distributive function of markets, which just means that, you know, there's a certain amount of wheat or shoes or whatever. And then the question is how to get them to the people who most need or want them, without assuming that therefore all the machinery and raw materials and energy that is used to produce them must themselves be allocated on a marketized basis. And then the last thing is the formative. And that's, I think, maybe the hardest to talk about, but it's all of the great social theories of the 20th century, beginning with people like Zimmel and so on, have to do with how something that gets turned into an object of market exchange actually can change its character, how the introduction of market relations can change social relations, how the commodity itself takes on a different ethos, if you like. So Marx famously distinguished between, what are the terms that he used, between formal and real subsumption. Like, you know, the first thing in an early stage of capitalism, the merchant brings all the weavers into, you know, one room and starts to pay them a wage. But the actual concrete character of their labor, what they do, doesn't change. Then that's the merely formal subsumption of labor. Then you get to a point where, with real subsumption, where, right, the idea that this is fundamentally a capital accumulation project starts to reorganize the character of the labor internally. Some eco-theorists have tried to distinguish between the real and formal and real subsumption of nature in the same way, which is very interesting. And I think we could also ask what happens, there's a lot of literature, what happens when forms of care work are done in the context of for-profit agencies, for-profit home health care agencies, and so on. And there you get the idea that commodification, marketization changes the quality of what it is that is being bought and sold in ways that it might be innocuous and nothing to worry about, but in other cases might actually have, right, some real impact that we should worry about. Can care be something organized for profit, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if this is fully an answer, but I'm trying to introduce some conceptual distinctions that allow us to disaggregate a number of different questions that we can raise about markets. And by saying no markets at the top and no markets at the bottom, I'm addressing these three issues. Let me just explain how. The top, to me, and this is where the rubber hits the road for me in terms of what I think is important about socialism. I think that on the very biggest questions, what a socialist society means is democratization of the biggest questions about allocation of social capacities, social resources, and above all, social surplus, whether there's going to be any, how much there's going to be, what's going to be done with it. Is it going to be a question of leisure or what? That doesn't exclude, in my view, paying people who organize enterprises some percentage to, you know, remunerate them for their contributions, allow them to live at a reasonable level, and so on. You know, again, think about COVID. What could, and I think should have happened, would have been a nationalization or federalization of the production of necessary material, right? Health goods, ventilators, PPE, disinfectant, all of that kind of stuff. And that, that wouldn't exclude, as in military contracts, that wouldn't exclude paying enterprises. In the military, it's cost plus. It usually means we pay you for what it cost you to build the fighter bomber plane, plus 10% is usually. So democratization surplus does not require that you actually, that there is state ownership of everything, but it does require that whatever percentage is paid out, whatever is left over, which should be a lot, is the wealth of the collective, and to be allocated by its democratic determination of its priorities. At the at the bottom end, where we're dealing with basic needs, and you can see how these two connect from the COVID case. At the bottom, then we are really talking about the whole question of public goods versus commodities. And I think the formative question enters there. You'll probably remember T.H. Marshall and what it means that everybody goes to the post office together to get their pension. That this has something to do with the meaning of these goods. And when you make them, this is why I don't, vouchers, Yang's basic income, I think, means that there's something changes in the meaning of those things when they are, even, when they're provided with some kind of a good backstop. So I think the formative comes into play there. And I guess that the good role of markets is their convenience as a distributive mechanism, insofar as they don't, in a problematic way, change the meaning and quality of the social relations, insofar as they don't introduce noxious, qualities, and insofar as they don't usurp this question, this allocative question, which to me is the most important thing that to be where the democratic question is most pressing. So that's how I think about all of that, and probably more to be said.
Thank you, Nancy. I just had a question regarding democratic socialism and how it fits into, I guess, what you've mapped out thus far in your plan. So you begin your paper by mentioning people like Bernie and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and organizations like the DSA. And I guess I'm wondering whether, as you see it now, whether democratic socialism is likely or is looking like it will offer more than simply democracy in the political realm, as you put it. Or I guess if we look specifically at programs that they're advocating for, like the Green New Deal, whether that constitutes enough of a challenge to the boundary struggle in the environmental realm.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Two very good questions. Part of the problem is that the phrase democratic socialism sometimes functions as literally a party name. And sometimes it's just a more general, characterization. As a general characterization, I'm happy to call myself a democratic socialist. I don't think I would say that is what this is. I would like to add some other qualifiers and say it's democratic, eco-feminist, anti-racist, but then we could become very long-winded. So fine, democratic socialism. Now, as a kind of more understood more narrowly as a party label, I would say that a lot of what passes under that label is hard to distinguish between a pretty good form of social democracy. So from which, great, could be a step forward perhaps, although without some of these larger changes, it's unclear whether social democracy actually can be really universalized on a global level. But that's a whole nother question, which we should look into as well. So I think this is why this question about the surplus is so pressing, right? The DSA version, is good on that bottom level, but it's unclear that you can really address the deep structural deformations of capitalism. This self-undermining tendency to constantly eat up the energies for community building, for social life, the energies and resources for repairing nature. It's unclear that you can do any of this without handling that question about surplus, or without at least disabling the accumulation dynamic that, you know, can you really get enough control over it in a social democratic agency? Because it's an immensely powerful dynamic, and its thrust is to just, you know, eat up everything within it's like something out of a horror movie, you know, to eat up everything in its path. Green New Deal is extremely interesting. Obviously, the New Deal reference, which I would have thought was had a highly local U.S. focus, turns out that people all over the world, you know, think that this is a phrase that is meaningful to them as well. So maybe it doesn't have to be as Americanocentric as I would have thought at the beginning. But the actual Green New Deal plans, I think there's, you know, there's wonderful debate in a whole series of essays in New Left Review in the last couple of years that have to do with degrowth versus Green New Deal versus eco-socialism. We've got, these are all quite different, and not that there's, you know, any one agreed on a definition of any of them, but whether Green New Deal, which focuses so heavily on infrastructure, and therefore seems to involve at first sight, you know, just millions of miles of concrete. You know, we know what the environmental impact of that is. I mean, this is even apart from the renewable energy basis and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think there are really deep questions, which I'm probably, you know, I'm somebody who reads this and that, but, you know, there are real questions that climate scientists and others that I'm not in a position, that we'd have to see whether the current understanding of Green New Deal in its official form as a proposal is actually compatible with saving the planet or not, right? And I think this is part of what I mean about that boundary question being a stake of struggle. I think even just those three words, degrowth. I have criticisms of degrowth, believe me, that's a problematic word already, but degrowth, Green New Deal, eco-socialism, each one of these is very contested, as is their relation to one another. But this is where a very important front line of social struggle is, especially as it intersects with questions of employment and income and all of that. The obvious appeal of Green New Deal is that you seem to be able to say to people, you can have it all. We can have all these manufacturing and construction jobs and so on, and they can be unionized and highly paid and so on. So you don't have to have that trade-off. But it might be that the kinds of jobs that Green New Deal proposals focus on are not or at least beyond a certain quantity, not the right jobs to be focusing on.
Yeah, Nancy, thank you for the talk, and also it was very interesting, the paper. I just have this question about the importance of the construction of a new idea of justice regarding these new proposals on socialism. And I also make this question because in the economics jargon and the heterodox economics studies on the debate between capitalism and socialism, there are a lot of people who forget this, the importance of this normative basis for new proposals to deal with commoditization, change of structures of labor, the relationship between allocation and reproduction, and also this relationship between goods, public goods and private goods has in the basis like has some implications for the change of our ideas of distributive justice. So I don't know if you can talk more about this in relationship to your reflections on socialism.
So what I've done in this paper, and it's a little different, but I hope not in contradiction with the work I did on redistribution, recognition, and representation. What I've done here is in a much more ad hoc way, as I was trying to spell out some of my intuitions, I realized that I was coming up with a sort of set of principles that were ad hocly enumerated, but not theorized together. And this would be one part of the job that I would have to do as I try to turn this little sketch into a book. But so among the principles that came out here was non-domination and the all-subjected principle, which I had written about before. And the new one that seemed very important and to flow organically from my own argument, but which I had never really thought about before, was this idea of pay as you go, no free riding. That we really have to start with some sense of what the true reproduction costs of a form of life are in all of those necessary instances with respect to public power, with respect to care and social reproduction, with respect to the ecological basis of our lives. So that to me was the kind of thing that was most interesting because most new to me about my own paper. Some of the other stuff was sort of filling in, things I had worked through before. So this is something I really want to pay more attention to. Let me just say again about COVID, and this will be my last comment. This relates really to Miranda's question about democratic socialism. Too much of the discussion of COVID, or even by Bernie, whom I adore, has been focused too much on how to make sure that individuals, especially working class individuals, populations, get what they need, that they have income replacement, that they have health insurance, all of these things sort of understood as individual goods, right? Divisible goods. And by contrast, we haven't had enough talk under this sort of justice rubric of infrastructure. So I sort of feel like as a feminist, I've been going on and on and on for decades, along with many, many other feminists, talking about how much production depends on reproduction. But I think one thing we're seeing now is how much reproduction depends on production, and how important it is to think about infrastructure in the collective sense, not just of individual consumables, even health insurance. Yeah, I can have health insurance, but if there aren't the equipment, the supplies, the doctors, the hospitals, the ventilators, et cetera, what good does it do me? So that's why this pay-as-you-go thing is so important. I don't think anyone realized how badly depleted the health systems, even not the United States, obviously, but even of countries with good health systems like Italy was, how badly depleted that had been. And, we know why. We can talk all about the European Union and so on and so forth. But I think I'm going to have to leave it there. All I can say is that this is work in progress, thought in progress, and there's so much more to do. And just talking to you about it has given me some more ideas as to things I need to get moving on. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for organizing this.
Thanks very much, and you will be able to listen to the rest of this.
I will.
If you want.
I promise I will. Send me a link.
So we let you go, and I saw Yanis wanting to ask something, except that I don't see his picture anymore.
Yes, Andrew,
there you are.
My connection is unstable, so I had to mute my video. Nancy, thank you for a great, I think it's the most pertinent issue, the interplay between capitalism and socialism. And I will try to be very brief. It's hard for me, of course, to do that. The first strand I want to bring forth to the discussion is the interplay between justice and liberty, and whether the libertarian or anarcho-communist, strand in the debate would be fruitful, because it seems to me that the mandated transaction that socialism seems to be keen on, like the state mandates, that's what you're going to do. You're going to have, you are forced into purchasing insurance. You are forced to do this. You are forced to do that. And it seems to me that capitalism abuses that. So capitalism takes socialistic programs, which happen everywhere because they're actually very humane and very rational to have, and then it abuses them and exploits them. And the first remedy there is to not provide the market, the clientele that would pay for these capitalistically abused socialist programs. And the libertarianism would provide the solution, because libertarianism also allows somebody to say no to a transaction instead of a forced yes.
I think that Miranda's previous question is a good way of introducing the answer to what Yanis just said. Fraser has this tripartite division of the economy, which is different than Marx's and different than in most reproduction schemes based on Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Tugan Baranovsky, and the rest. She has a sphere of accumulation. She had, or rather, she doesn't want to call it that. There's a sphere of investment where investment decisions are made. There's a sphere of consumption, and then there's a sphere of needs, which is a third sphere. I mean, to the extent that her paper has many original features, but this is the one thing that, on the level of economics at least, is an original proposal. Doesn't mean that it should be supported, but it is original. With respect to the question of integrating freedom, which clearly she does most of the time. I mean, her values are liberty, equality, solidarity, and she wants to realize all of them in a future system. When it, however, comes to this tripartite division, then it is obvious on some level that the level of needs is not a realm of freedom, because somebody was going to have to determine what needs are. You cannot just announce that your needs are for a houseboat or a very fancy house or whatever it is. I mean, needs would have to be. So in most countries, I don't know if she's familiar with it. I am, because I even grew up in for a while in one. You would have rationing. It would be a rationing system in which the most fundamental needs would be rationed. One should not be fooled about the European welfare or medical systems. There is rationing there as well. And this has to do with ultimately the fact that the demand in such a sphere would be extremely large. And so that has to be in some ways controlled. And so I don't think that the demand of the domain of needs is a realm of freedom. Certainly, the commodity sphere, which I'm not sure how she's going to isolate and differentiate from the others, is a domain of individual freedom. You will earn a certain amount of money. She even says that managers get a special recompense, whatever that is. You get a certain amount of money, even a guaranteed income is money. And within that sphere, you spend it as you want. So that is a domain of freedom. And if you really want to eat broccoli, that's what you're going to eat. But if you want to eat meat instead, in spite of the fact that somebody else next to you is a vegetarian, you get a chance to eat meat. Anyway, the second domain is the domain of freedom. Now, the first domain is really the most interesting one, because she actually would say the first domain is a domain of even greater freedom. It's a domain of collective freedom. The commodity domain, the second level, is a domain of freedom individually. We each decide what we purchase, and we each decide how to spend our money. We could even save it and delay our consumption. That's not the possibility in the first sphere on the individual level. But her argument is that it's a domain of collective freedom, because there the democratic collectivity would decide together whether to accumulate. She doesn't like the word accumulate, but obviously accumulation is necessary even to restore the machinery that you already have, or whether you want to actually spend it on current consumption, or do you want to support the consumption of future generations? Do you want to actually consume, or you want to spare nature? These decisions would be done collectively. I myself have a very big question on this, but I now want to trouble you with it. And now, namely, simply that the democratic collectivity is unable to make those decisions democratically. When you are dealing with 50,000 items, imagine a meeting where you even have to decide the price or the amount of 2 items, 3 items. Even those meetings take a long time. To have meetings which decide every single production good, because that's what we're talking about here, every single production good in a complex economy, 40, 50,000 in the United States maybe, or 100,000. You can't, this has to be delegated. So the democracy part of this is to elect a body that does it. Now, what extent does it remain a realm of freedom, collective freedom, once you delegate that function to a body? Who's in fact the central planner, democratically accountable, but nevertheless is a central planner of some kind. Those who really study the subject have raised the fundamental issue of principal-agent problem. The principal is the democratic electorate, but the agent is something else. It's a managerial board, it's a planning board, it's some kind of institution. And how do you maintain, think about the United States today, for example. Our representatives are our agents. We're the principals who elect them. How good does the control of the principal work over the agent in our democratic system? But I mean, think about whatever more democratic systems, even whether it's a council communist one or a parliamentary one. These problems will be very serious in all those settings. And I think to think of that realm as a realm of collective freedom would take a certain amount of leap in faith. The only realm of freedom left in her scheme is that of the commodity sphere, the second one. And that's the one that she's most embarrassed about, because she has to leave it. Socialism wanted to eliminate it. She has to restore it, market socialism. But yes, that would be a domain of free choice. Okay, so whoever is next can go next. I will call on you and then mute myself. And Eamon, yeah, please.
Professor Arato or Andrew, personally I prefer Professor, but okay. So
I prefer Andrew, it's better.
Okay.
I call you Eamon, so you can call me Andrew.
Okay.
I don't need Mr. Niazi.
Your class, your rules. So she made a distinction between 3 ways to look at markets, but I wasn't able to follow along with the reasoning. Would you recall what those 3 distinctions were? I just know the first one is allocating the resources, and maybe someone else.
Allocating resources, structuring society. What's the third? But now 3 things, I always forget one of them. It supposedly comes from Polanyi. I guess it would be there. It would be a simple frame of exchange, right? Exchange like a market, for example, in a tribal world. There's still a market, and what is it for? It's really a way of exchanging. It's actually a way of fostering some division of labor and comparative efficiency. So that's the first function, if I got it right. The second function is, in fact, to steer the accumulation, right? That's the allocative function. It decides how much is going to be saved, how much is going to be spent on consumption, today's consumption, future generations. So that's the allocative function. And the third one is Polanyi's contribution, namely structuring social relations. That's Lukács's reification, Verdinglichung in German, if any of you know that body language still. Okay, so it's reification, and that is the commodification of social relations. So, for example, give you a simple example. If you buy a spouse through the internet, right, and that spouse is delivered to you, that is a commodification of the marriage relationship. Immanuel Kant, who was never married, and I don't know if he ever had sex, defined marriage as a contract for our mutual use of sexual organs. That would be, I think, a kind of commodification of a fundamental social relationship. That would be the third. I don't say that those things are commodified in our society, although if you think about prostitution and you think about pornography on the internet, then there's a lot of commodification of sexuality also. So that's the three. Who's next? You know, I feel funny pretending I'm Nancy Fraser. Actually, we don't agree on lots of things, but you know, that's how things are.
Andrew, can I ask a question that
John.
Is kind of I'm going to ask you to kind of compare the Blackburn reading and the Fraser reading. So Fraser said that, social surplus is going to be the social wealth. No private person, firm, or state can own it. And Blackburn kind of, highlights this problem that Hayek talks about. It is, the fact that socialism doesn't really give us the rational economic decision-making, which, is kind of provided by these competitive markets. So does Fraser talk about that problem at all?
Oh, listen, there are two fundamental differences between Fraser and Blackburn. They're good friends, by the way, and Robin is a friend of mine too. But there's two really fundamental differences. And you'll see the importance of the difference when we are dealing with Römer. One fundamental difference is that she doesn't pay any attention to the history of state socialism, right? I mean, much of Robin's article is retelling that history. Now, it's an embarrassment. I can understand it. I lived in such a country. But of course, there were reform attempts and interesting ones, as we talked about last time with Sanjay Reddy. But she pays no attention to that history. That's the first thing. And the second thing is she pays no attention to the critics of socialism. That's not just Hayek and von Mises. You heard Anwar Sheikh stress Hayek, and there's Mises, but there are many others, including even Polanyi himself, from some point of view. All the market socialists are critics of the traditional scheme of socialism. Now, she accepts their view to the extent she reintegrates market, but she does not. The two fundamental problems for Hayek. You see, if you read now the brilliant article, the brilliant book, really, by Römer, you'll see that the debates between the left and the right here, which Anwar Sheikh also presented, those debates took place in several rounds. And the first round had to do with the problem of information. That's the one von Mises claimed that socialism is never going to solve. The market gives us a lot of information about what people want, and not just people in Department 1, where they consume commodities, but the managers themselves in Department 2, we have to also figure out what are all the things they want and at what price are they able to have it. And that the market does. That's the information function. And in the debate of the 20s, it was shown that under some conditions, information function can be either substituted for by a lot of computers. I never buy that particular story, but it can be done, as Oskar Lange claimed, through creating pseudo markets. And one of the things that state socialist planners will do is look at the price of commodities in the capitalist world and use that as a kind of pseudo market, for example, to decide the price around which efficient production can take place. So the information problem was in some ways soluble in that debate. And then, as you can see in Römer's analysis, Hayek, a brilliant, horrible man, of course, horrible man. He accepted authoritarianism because democracy is dangerous from point of view of the maintenance of capitalism. Horrible man, supported Pinochet even and this kind of thing, but nevertheless a brilliant man, as you could see with Anwar Sheikh, who presented him. He said, there's another problem, and that's the incentive problem. That's the responsibility problem. That even if you are getting signals from economic actors, if they don't pay the cost for giving you the wrong signal, for having banked on the wrong price, it doesn't matter anymore from their point of view. And of course, this means that efficiencies cannot follow. Janos Kornai, that's our topic last week, right? Since you already presented it, reconstructs this issue. He thinks the information problem is important too, but the problem of incentive is reconstructed as a soft budgetary constraint. I'm so impressed by the fact that Robin Blackburn pays attention to that. And even the Kornai, he says, shifted to private capitalism in a radical way, and he finds it problematic, as do I also. Nevertheless, you cannot forget this problem of property. Nancy adopts a good view on that, but we don't know why she has done it. It doesn't explain. The view is that in the commodity sphere, you would have multiple forms of property. That's important because that's how you have competition. But she doesn't have property at all participating in sphere 1 and sphere 3. If you understand what I'm talking about, if you haven't read her paper, you wouldn't know what I'm just meant. So multiple properties only in the middle sphere, the sphere of commodity exchange. That's important, but it is one, but why is it there? Well, it's there because without it, you have no competition. And without competition, there's no penalty for failure. And without a penalty for failure, the soft budgetary constraint allows you to pay attention to no technological issue of technological change, efficiencies, alternatives, all that becomes irrelevant. So yes, there's a very big difference between Blackburn and Fraser on this. Blackburn is not an economist, he's a historian, wrote wonderful things on history of slavery, but he pays enough attention to economics. I'm not an economist either, but we cannot have socialism discussed without economics, right? Okay, so that's a long answer to your question, but it was a really important question. And you'll see the point much more with Römer during our last session, because John Römer attempts very, very rigorously to build in the objections of Hayek, Kornai, Mises, and all the others, and still develop a concept of socialism. See, we cannot go back to Marx's time and forget everything that had been experienced since then and everything that has been written since then. And they're even related because, of course, Hayek and Mises are critics of Bolshevism. But Keynes, too, of course, has to come into this picture as well. And that was the job of the economists who spoke here before. Okay, so who's next? These questions are very excellent today, which proves that her paper is very good because a good paper produces good questions. So who's next?
Yeah, so I didn't expect this, but my question will be kind of Leninist. So her model is somehow, like in my reading, applicable to kind of advanced capitalism. and like from this kind of, from the very top of the system. And like my question is, what is to be done for kind of less advanced countries or societies, whatsoever, which are not yet at this stage? Yeah.
We go back now to the history, right? Because that's how, well, it wasn't the very beginning of this course, but during the middle at some point, we raised the question of skipping stages, of permanent revolution. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, he's kind of a countryman of yours, although he's not Ukrainian, but he is still from the same world, of course, raises this question. And he raised it during the First World War and kind of anticipated before. Trotsky, in a way, in permanent revolution, even raised it before them. And of course, the Chinese students know that this is a central matter for China, right? Where of all the countries, at least with respect to Eastern Europe, where the Leninist formulas are adopted, is China, which is much less developed in 1948 than the Soviet Union is, and certainly Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, even Hungary had much more developed industrial apparatus. They were less agricultural. Yet in China, it was done. So, okay, now, of course, the obvious answer to this is, and Nancy would say, well, the last thing we want to do now is create an egalitarian framework based on scarcity or on shortage or on underdevelopment. And Marx in 1843 even raised this question. It would be a socialism of poverty, which is not his model. His model is supposed to be a socialism of abundance. Okay, but Igor says, yes, but there are a lot of countries which are not at that stage. Even today, right? If you look at Latin America, there are a lot of very poor countries. China has now, amazingly enough, broken the poverty trap, and Vietnam perhaps also, but North Vietnam has not. And there are other places around the world. And what about them? Now, would not be fair to use this as a criticism of Fraser, because Nancy really does bring in imperialism as some part of the Marxian tradition. Lenin, of course, brought it in, and considers that imperialism has created debts. Imperialism has created debts. There is a gender debt, there is a racial debt, there's a sexuality debt, there is a nature debt. These debts have to be paid, even by a new socialist regime in a developed country. Assuming that you're right, and it has to be a developed country, there will be these debts. Now, how does that go together with the democratic transition? I have some serious doubts, because you're asking a democratic electorate in country A, let us say the Ukraine, to pay the debts of the Tsarist regime 100 years before. Or you're asking an American electorate to pay the debts of American imperialism or racism, for that matter. And it's not even certain that the descendants of those slaves will want to pay those debts. But in any case, paying the debt is not consistent with the idea of limiting accumulation and socializing the surplus. But in any case, Nancy, even though she has incompatible elements in her conception, does have this element of paying that debt. And I think paying the debt with respect to countries that have been exposed to colonialism and imperialism would mean that the developed countries have a very, very large responsibility. It's not Trotsky's permanent revolution, where you, through a revolutionary process, foster their revolutionary transformation too. Most of the decolonized areas now are democracies of one kind or another. But it is an idea that it is there in contemporary moral and political theory. For example, Porgy, a political scientist at Yale, writes about this extensively. There is a debt which would have to be paid by the developed countries to the less developed ones. There are some countries today that consider their responsibility to pay part of their debt. Norway, I would say, is in the forefront of that. So there are countries which really spend, And even the United States, now that was not because of paying any kind of debt, it was because they were fighting the communist competitor. But in any case, there was a tremendous amount of foreign aid given to poorer countries. And I think Nancy's view would have to be that that debt has to be paid, in that sense, equalizing international settings. And I think that would be, it would follow from her conception. And I think it would raise some questions about growth and about dealing with the surplus and other related questions, which would not be easy to solve. Okay, so whoever is next.
My question is related to what both, I think it was discussed both by you and of course, Nancy also discusses it in her book too. And it is related to, from what we discussed about both market, the role of market in, you know, in whatever future socialist society, and also democracy, in the sense that, according to, of course, her, and she quotes from Habermas, that the freedom and autonomy of each individual is dependent on the autonomy. The autonomy and freedom of everyone, of collective. And so I was wondering how this is related, of course, to what you said about the constituent power and the constituted power, their relation, and the relation of course, of democratic politics and the socialist economy in that sense.
Again, very excellent, excellent question. So the first part, I would say that you have to remember that economies need to be coordinated, right? So an economy of a tribe even is coordinated by kinship structures. Every economy has to be coordinated. Polanyi, for example, whom she admires, and I do too very, very much, had 3 such coordinating mechanisms. And she depends on Polanyi for 2 of them: market, redistribution, that's part of her writings, and reciprocity. If you read Polanyi, but if you'd have to read anthropological literature more generally, you see that reciprocity is based on the idea of the gift. Marcel Mauss would be the most important author who has written on it, but there are others. Reciprocity means you give, not in the form of exchange, but as a part of cycling around our relations with one another. You're going to get a gift from one person and you give a gift to another. And what Mauss, for example, reconstructed is a 20-year gap sometimes before you get anything after you've given a gift. So that's reciprocity. There is a lot of reciprocity in our lives. I mean, think about the family. I mean, we can't, a la Immanuel Kant, reduce the family to exchange. We don't want the state to regulate, right, our family relations, our sexuality, and so on. So reciprocity is the third mechanism. And sexuality, which involves giving, right, it involves things even, right, I mean, material things, is best regulated by reciprocity. So then we have these 3 schemes. Fraser is usually operating with redistribution and market. So your question is, how does democracy come in? That's the first part of your question. And she wants to say that we have redistribution now, but it is done in an authoritarian way, whether it's under state socialism or even in welfare states, by non-really accountable representatives. And they, of course, redistribute, but she wants democratic redistribution. I already criticized that conception, but it can be improved through accountability, through multiple democratic forms, through social movements influencing the state. So it can be improved. So in that sense, democracy can come in, and perhaps we can improve the idea of a democratic form of coordination to the extent that we link it to redistribution. You cannot link it to market. No democracy can tell you what you're going to pick, apples or pears. If it tells you, then you're in big trouble. Well, the rationing system in her third sphere, yes, democracy tells you that. You're going to eat pears. In Hungary, I never saw a banana or an orange until somebody on a trip from Italy brought me a banana. This was 1954 or 5. I was 7 years old. Wow, that's a banana. An orange you could have maybe once a year. Because, of course, Hungary could have used sparse foreign currency reserves to buy bananas and oranges. Italy, too, doesn't grow bananas. But in any case, that was not the right use. And so I had to eat apples. And no strawberries and raspberries in the fall either, if you eat those fruits here in the fall. So yes, you ate in the seasons, whatever it was, but price then was low, whatever. So that's how the market perhaps can be influenced, individual consumption, but in that case, it's replaced by a rationing system. So that's your first question. The second one I will answer too separately, because that's the Arato question. That's what I raised. I raised the question of the constituent power, constituted power. This, what I just discussed, was the constituted power. How do you bring together different properties and coordination mechanisms? Well, that has to be designed. You know, everybody always says, ever since Uncle Charlie, I mean, Karl Marx, that we're not going to give any blueprints here. Let people do in their freedom what they want. Well, I mean, we have had too many non-blueprint-like transformations where, in the end, nothing was promised, so those in power could do whatever they wanted. I think by now we kind of want blueprints. I want blueprints. That's why I like Römer, who gives us a blueprint. We can criticize it. But I think it's important now to talk about blueprints. Now, if indeed you had the right blueprint, then you'd have to institute it. Who's going to institute it? That's where the constituent power comes in. A constituted power means that you already are arranging these relations in some way. The Constitution can tell you how to do it. It can be done through informal mechanisms like the United Kingdom, which has no written constitution, but it is done anyway. The British welfare state is not in a document called the Constitution of the United Kingdom, yet they got one. It's just a statute that establishes the national health system. But in any case, we don't want to do it the British way. I think that is a really obsolete way that almost no one follows today, a few exceptions like Israel, Saudi Arabia, but all countries want to constitutionalize these matters. India does it in the most brilliant way, but it was not the first. Mexico before instituted a welfare state through the Constitution of 1918, and the Weimar Republic did it. So these matters can be constitutionalized. I would want to constitutionalize them. You know, you just don't want to leave any which majority to do what Margaret Thatcher did and take back or at least some aspects of the welfare system. So we want to constitutionalize it. So the constituent power comes in. But this raises very serious matters, because it cannot just be Napoleon Bonaparte who said, "Je suis le pouvoir constituant." That's a constituent power. The emperor says, "I am the constituent power," and he establishes the Code Napoleon on the basis of his say-so. That cannot be our way, right? So then, you know, I think there are really just two fundamental ways, maybe a third, since I've written on it so much. I should say there are three ways, but traditionally with the history of socialism, reform and revolution are the two ways. In other words, one way is you elect a democratic government, and that democratic government could either through statutes like the United Kingdom or through a new constitution, I don't know, Mexico, that was a revolutionary assembly. It's not quite right for the example that I was picking. Australia, for example, around 1900, it was democratic elected bodies that give Australia a constitution. It's an extremely good process, by the way, even though it's not so well known, because when something works well, people don't really know it. it was done in an ultra-democratic way, it was going back and forth between electorates and the constitution-making body. It could be done that way, but it was still reformist. It was done on the basis of existing political, your provinces where the constituent power, in a way, like in America too. They created them more provinces. Well, that's another story. In any case, that's the democratic way. And the revolutionary way, well, we know, we talk about it here often enough. Someone takes power and decides how it is to be done. And if it's being done one way, for example, the Bolsheviks have a constituent assembly. The constituent assembly is elected in November of 1917, is in session for a couple of sessions in January of 1918, and then it's dissolved. And then Bertolt Brecht has this joke. If you don't like the people, he says to the Central Committee in 1953, pick another one. That's what Lenin did. Didn't like the people elected through a democratic election, the assembly, so he picked another one. In any case, it could be done that way. But both are problematic for Nancy's framework. Both are problematic, and she never answered my question. I didn't think she would. I don't believe she could. I could answer my own question, but that's another matter, and I will in just a second. But in any case, if you do it a reformist way, then you are too wedded to the institutions that allowed you to come to power. So, for example, the American and the Australian constituent assemblies are based on the provinces or the states. Well, in America it was called states by that time. And of course, they were not going to abolish themselves in the process. So tomorrow we'll see this in the discussion of the other class. Amazingly enough, a federal system comes out of the Australian and the American constituent processes. Yes, of course, it had to, right? The states were not going to abolish themselves. They didn't say, I don't know how many people know German, heraus mit uns, out with us. No, they created a constitution in which they remained an important dimension of the system. And that means, of course, that the radicalism of Nancy's proposal would be very difficult to achieve on the basis of the reformist road. And a revolutionary road, which could accomplish it, would require the revolutionary elite to agree with Nancy. She's going to be very upset when she hears all this, because I'm putting words into her mouth. But that's me, this is when I engage in political discussions, I tell the truth. I'm a truth sayer. So the revolutionary vanguard would have to agree with Nancy. Now, what are the chances of that? And secondly, in the process of imposing that plan on a society in which a lot of people don't agree, they'd have to do things they never expected they would have to do. Islamic Revolution, they never thought they would be doing it quite that way, that the thing would be bloody and all the rest. It became. And of course, Stalin and all the rest. Well, these things follow. So the revolutionary way is not a way of accomplishing it either. So I would say the third way is mine, but it will not actually lead to Nancy's outcome. It could lead to the one closest to it. It would mean multiple democratic channels participate in producing a constituent assembly. And then they negotiate and compromise their differences. And when you compromise, then those who have a proposal like Nancy would get some of what they want. And I think that that would be the best we could do. I don't think she's going to necessarily buy that, but Robin Blackburn likes that. Robin Blackburn's discussion, there's a lot of discussion of socialism, not a blueprint, but rather the result of negotiation and compromise. Even Robin, who used to be a Trotskyist, was affected by the transitions of '89 and the negotiated transitions. So it would have to be negotiated, and different political opinions would have to come in. And there, Nancy's views would be important. If she can convince a lot of people, then of course, more of her proposal would be realized. Okay, well, that's the very long answer to you, Arya, but you provoked me with this constituent power, so there it is. Yeah, sure.
Andrew, we kind of heard from Nancy about her answer to the COVID-19 and how it would transform our understanding of capitalism. in her paper, she lists 4 non-economic preconditions of capitalism. And the fourth one, the last one, is large fund of public goods supplied and provided by the state. So I was going to ask you and your take on this. Do you think these public goods are still provided and guaranteed by the state in this pandemic? And do you think it would, like this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, would have a transforming impact on today's capitalism?
Totally brilliant question. And it's really important. Now, I have to say, I kind of agreed with her analysis of COVID and why it's a crisis on multi-levels, not just one. It illustrates the theory. I mean, no one is happy about COVID, but there's a tiny little benefit she gains from it, is that she could illustrate all the 4 forms of injustice, and they become crises. See, one of my natural objections to her scheme is that crisis is misused when it's used for these 4 domains in a parallel way. Every one of them has element of injustice, obviously, right? If women get to do housework and do not develop their full personality because of that, if people of different sexual orientation are left out of the job market in different places, if some races are super exploited or people abroad are super exploited, if public benefits are not democratically controlled and distributed in an unequal way, these are all injustices. But they're not crises as such. Now, COVID makes that objection of mine a little bit moot, because right now, these are all parts of the crisis. They're mini crises within the larger crisis. Women suffer over the COVID, even though men get it more, it turns out. And yet, on the employment question, it is women who are likely to, because people who are doing housework for people are most likely are not being paid. And yet they live on that. Yet they don't even have health benefits. And they're mostly women. So women are really exposed. And of course, racial groups. COVID is very racialized. African Americans are suffering much more from it. So you can see how COVID really raises to crisis level injustices in all the spheres you mentioned. And of course, in the state domain of welfare, well, United States, you can see. I mean, now it's not as if countries with good welfare systems don't suffer. And it's interesting to make a distinction here between Italy and the United States and Germany and the United States. Italy has a very good healthcare system, but relatively little money is put into it. As Nancy said, especially because of European pressure, because of the neoliberal atmosphere in the European Union, cuts have been made into the system. And the Italian system is responding poorly in a very wealthy part of Italy, by the way. The north is the wealthy part because of cuts in the system previously. But there are also countries which have not had to make those cuts because of their advantages, economic advantages. And so Germany, which is a very well-developed welfare system, has also a well-financed one. And so the number of deaths in Germany is lower than everywhere else. In the United States, it's neither a good system nor is it well-financed. So not so surprising that the United States is going to have the epicenter. Now, why New York? Well, because it is the cosmopolitan city. That's the city which is most exposed through travelers, tourists, families, people going to places. So, of course, relatively cosmopolitan cities like Paris, like Milan, but Berlin too would be, in principle, London would be, in principle, very exposed. Then it depends on the welfare system, whether there will be a crisis or not. Germany did not have a real crisis. Of course, people dying is always bad, but look at the numbers for Germany. And I think it would be an interesting study for a sociology student, economics student, political science student, to compare the response of the welfare systems to relatively equal exposure. Let's say Paris, New York, London, Montreal, London, world cities. I don't know about Buenos Aires, where it would not have the same number of people traveling and traveling to. But one could then compare in relation to welfare services. And of course, then the racial aspect could be studied and the gender aspect. So I actually buy her analysis on this. Now, to be fair, Yanis gave us all an email, or rather a comment that the analysis does not apply because COVID is helping with, I don't know if people have seen it, with nature. In other words, to the extent that we have reduced production, we're improving the air, improving the water, improving, I don't take that to be a really serious objection to what Nancy said. And it would be very temporary anyway, because it's the structural issues over the long term that have the ecological consequences. What, of course, I have to say is that state socialism is much worse for the environment than any capitalism. You compare the data for air and for water, for natural resources, and they are extremely poor for state socialism. I don't know how it works for Cuba. By the way, Cuba would be one state socialist system that might be doing well under the COVID challenge, because it's not so cosmopolitan, not that many people. Well, yes, from Europe, you just have a lot of travelers, and some from the United States. But it does also have a healthcare system, which unfortunately, because of the special period, as the Cubans call it, has been deprived of a lot of resources. So when it comes to drugs, for example, there's a huge shortage in Cuba. And preventive care doesn't help much with this particular disease. It might help for the second round or the third round. But it would be interesting to compare Cuba with a relatively similar level of development in Latin America. Say Costa Rica, say Nicaragua. I don't want to bring in Venezuela because COVID is going to be a disaster in Venezuela when it hits. And of course that is true, but maybe with Colombia. Mexico is too large a country and too close to the United States. So I don't think it is a good object for comparison. Okay, I think we'll end it with that. Questions were especially terrific today, and they were especially terrific because it's a testimony to Nancy. She's so bright and so clear that even when she's wrong, we at least know what the issues are. Okay, thank you very much.